I lost my family's entire $85,000 legacy to the man I loved. My father wouldn't even look at me. I hit rock bottom, thinking it was over, until he threatened my family. That's when I stopped being a victim and started planning my revenge. My name is Serafina, but everyone calls me Sarah. I'm 30 years old, and for a living, I piece together the fractured histories of old buildings. I can tell you the story of a house just by the wear on its floorboards. But I never learned how to spot the rot in a beautiful lie until it had consumed my own foundation. He's coming. Everyone in position. I knew you'd make the right decision, my love. He thought this was his final victory. He didn't know it was a trap. He had stolen my family's legacy, shattered my father's trust, and pushed us to the brink of ruin. What he didn't know was that I was no longer the woman he'd conned. I was my family's revenge, and this is the story of how I took everything back. But before I could set the trap, I had to fall into it, and my story doesn't begin in the cold shadow of a hotel bar. It begins 6 months earlier, under the humid, weeping willows of Savannah, Georgia. My life was contained, orderly. I spent my days restoring the soul of historic homes, preserving the past for a city that breathes it like air. My world smelled of sawdust, old paper, and turpentine. It was a good life, a quiet one, but it was a life reeling from a profound loss. My grandmother, the matriarch of our family and the keeper of all our stories, had passed away just 2 months prior. Her absence left a silence in our family home that no amount of work could fill. She wasn't just my grandmother, she was my compass. In her will, she left me a gift that was both a blessing and a burden, an inheritance of exactly $85,000. It came with a handwritten letter, the paper worn soft from her touch. In it, she confessed something she'd hidden from all of us. The historic family home, the one she was born in, the one I spent my childhood summers exploring, was in financial trouble. A series of bad investments by my grandfather years ago had left a lingering debt, and the bank was threatening foreclosure. Her final wish was for me to use that $85,000 as the down payment to save it, to secure our history, to keep our legacy from becoming just another plaque on a wall. I held that letter, her familiar looping script blurring through my tears, and I made a promise, not just to her, but to every ancestor whose portrait hung in that hallway. I would save our home. I would be the one to fix it all. It's a heavy thing, isn't it, to be the one chosen to carry a legacy? If you've ever felt the weight of your family's history on your shoulders, just type the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far these stories of ours reach. The responsibility felt immense, a cloak of honor and anxiety I wore every day. But with the grief still so raw, the weight felt unbearable at times. I'd walk through the grand, empty rooms of that house, tracing the carvings on the mantelpiece, and the silence would scream at me. It was a profound loneliness, a vulnerability I hadn't felt since I was a child. I had my family's legacy in a bank account, a sacred promise in my heart, and an emptiness inside me that felt vast and endless. I didn't know it then, but that emptiness was the perfect space for a monster to build his home. That gaping emptiness I felt wasn't something I talked about. To my family, I was the strong one, the architect, the fixer, the one holding the blueprint to save us. But alone, in the suffocating quiet of my apartment, I was just a woman grieving her grandmother, terrified of failing a promise I'd made to a ghost. And it was in that quiet desperation that I did something I never thought I would. I downloaded a dating app, not just any app, but one of those exclusive, curated ones. The kind that promised meaningful connections and vetted its members, which gave me a false sense of security. I told myself I was just looking for a distraction, a single night of conversation that wasn't about debt or death. But I was lying. I was looking for an ally. So I scrolled. I swiped through an endless parade of perfect, polished lives. Men standing on mountaintops, men laughing on yachts, men posing with expensive cars. Each profile was a carefully constructed advertisement for a life without flaws. Everyone presents their highlight reel, don't they? The perfect vacation, the successful career, the witty bio. But the real story is always in the footnotes, in the things they don't show you. Let me know in the comments. Do you think someone's online profile is more of a resume or a fantasy? I'm genuinely curious what you all think. I was about to give up, convinced this digital world was just a gallery of beautiful facades, when his profile appeared. Adrian, 32. Investment consultant. The pictures were perfect. Almost too perfect. One in a flawlessly tailored suit, the skyline of Atlanta blurring behind him. Another, more candid, showed him laughing as a golden retriever tried to lick his face. A third, the one that stopped me, showed him in a museum, looking intently at an oil painting with a thoughtful, serious expression. But it was his bio that felt like it had been written just for me. Appreciator of history, good bourbon, and conversations that last past midnight, looking for a partner to build a legacy with. Legacy. That one word. It was a dog whistle for my soul. I liked his profile, and within an hour, he messaged me. His first words weren't, "Hey," or "What's up?" He commented on a picture I'd uploaded of the family home. "The craftsmanship on that porch is breathtaking," he wrote. "Looks like a Victorian Gothic revival, maybe late 1882. He was right, of course. He'd seen the detail, the history, not just the picture. He'd seen me. Our conversations flowed like water. He was intelligent, witty, and deeply empathetic. When I cautiously mentioned my grandmother's passing, he didn't offer cheap platitudes. Instead, he shared a tender story about his own grandfather, a man he claimed had taught him that the only thing we truly own is our name and the stories attached to it. He was creating a bridge between us, built from a shared, fabricated grief. Every word he typed was a calculated move. I talked about my passion for restoring old buildings, and he called it a noble calling. I mentioned the weight of my promise to save the family home, and he called it my birthright. He wasn't just flattering me, he was validating the deepest, most sacred parts of my identity. He wasn't positioning himself as a date, he was positioning himself as my partner, my confidant, the co-author of my family's next chapter. He was everything my grieving, burdened heart was crying out for. After a week of messages that felt more real than my own life, we agreed to meet for drinks at a quiet, historic bar downtown. I remember standing in front of my mirror that night, a nervous energy buzzing under my skin that I hadn't felt in years. It felt like hope. Looking back, I now know what it was. It was the calm, placid surface of the water just before the shark breaks through. The bar was exactly the kind of place my grandmother would have loved, all dark wood, worn leather, and the hushed reverence of a library. Adrian was already there, seated at a quiet corner table. He stood up when I walked in, and his smile was even more captivating in person. For 3 hours, the world outside ceased to exist. He never once looked at his phone. He leaned in when I spoke, his eyes fixed on mine, making me feel as if my words were the only thing that mattered. He asked about the specific chemical compounds I use to treat reclaimed wood, about the challenges of matching 100-year-old plaster. He made my niche, nerdy profession sound like the most fascinating job on earth. He was a master at sharing curated vulnerabilities. He told me about a tech startup he'd poured his heart into years ago that had failed, losing him a significant amount of money. He framed it as a lesson in humility. "Sometimes you have to lose everything," he said, staring into his bourbon, "to figure out what's actually worth building." It was brilliant. It made him seem human, relatable. It explained away any potential financial instability and painted him as a resilient survivor, not a failure. He walked me to my car, and in the soft glow of the gaslights on Jones Street, he didn't try to kiss me. He just took my hand, his thumb gently tracing a circle over my knuckles. "I haven't had a conversation like that in a very long time, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I'll call you tomorrow." And he did. He called, he texted, he sent me pictures of architectural details he'd spot around the city, saying they made him think of me. I was completely and utterly hooked. That Sunday, during our weekly family lunch, I was practically glowing. I couldn't wait to tell my father. My dad is a man carved from old Southern oak, stoic, proud and fiercely protective of our family's name. He listened patiently as I recounted my perfect date, his fork and knife still. When I finished, he dabbed his mouth with his napkin, a gesture I knew meant he was choosing his words carefully. "And this man, this Adrian," he began, his voice level. "What's his family name? Where are his people from?" I faltered. I don't know. We didn't really get into that. He's a freelancer, a consultant." "A consultant for what?" he pressed. "Who does he consult for?" "Investments, Dad. He helps people build things." My answers sounded flimsy even to my own ears. My father put his silverware down and looked at me, his eyes filled with a sad, knowing gravity. "Serafina," he said, using my full name. "Men who are building things don't have vague answers. Be careful. This city is full of charming ghosts. They can smell old money and fresh grief from a mile away. Don't you let a stranger write himself into our story." I felt a hot flash of anger. "Dad, you haven't even met him. For the first time since Grandma died, I feel happy. Can't you just accept that?" The battle line was drawn. His caution felt like a criticism of my judgment, pushing me further into Adrian's corner. A few days later, I met my best friend, Dom, for coffee. I was hoping for an ally. As a detective, Dom reads people for a living, but his friendship is my safest harbor. He listened to my side of the story, stirring his black coffee. "So, he's perfect," Dom said, a statement, not a question. "His amazing," I corrected. He took a sip and leaned back, his cop eyes analyzing me. "Look, Sarah, I'm happy you're happy. But let me give you some unsolicited big brother advice." He leaned forward. "You spend your life restoring historic buildings. You know that before you do anything, you have to check the foundation. You tap the walls, you look for termites, you check for rot behind the fresh paint. Do the same with him, please." He smiled to soften the blow. "I'm not saying he's a bad guy. I'm just saying, I don't show him the original blueprints to the family vault on the second date." His words, like my father's, were meant to be a shield, but all I felt was another wall going up between me and the people I trusted most. Their skepticism didn't make me cautious. It made me defiant. It made my budding relationship with Adrian feel like ours a secret garden they weren't allowed into. And in doing so, they left the gate wide open for the fox. The next month was a blur of manufactured perfection. Adrian integrated himself into my life so seamlessly, it felt as though he'd always been there. We'd spend Saturdays walking through the sun-dappled squares of Savannah, his hand always finding mine. He'd listen for hours as I talked about my plans for the house, offering insights so brilliant it was like he could see the finished masterpiece in his mind's eye. He even came with me to the house one afternoon. I watched him run a hand over the hand-carved mahogany banister, his expression one of pure reverence. "A place like this isn't made of wood and plaster, Sarah," he whispered, his voice echoing in the grand, empty foyer. "It's made of promises. It's a legacy. Our legacy." He was an artist, and I was his canvas. He was painting a future so beautiful, so vivid, that I couldn't bear to look away. He was everything my father and Dom thought he wasn't, and every perfect moment felt like a victory, a small "I told you so" that I savored in silence. The crack in the facade appeared on a Tuesday night. It had been a perfect day. We'd had a picnic in Forsyth Park, and now we were back at my apartment, slow dancing in the living room to an old vinyl record. I was blissfully happy, my head resting on his chest, when I felt him tense up. The rhythm of his heart changed. He sighed, a heavy, troubled sound that broke the spell. "What's wrong?" I asked, pulling back to look at him. He shook his head, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing. It's nothing. I don't want to burden you with it." Of course, that just made me press him. "Adrian, talk to me. We're a team, remember?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd come to associate with his vulnerable side. He walked over to the window, staring out at the city lights. "It's just business stuff." "So boring," he said with a short, humorless laugh. "A big client's payment is delayed. It happens. But it's just bad timing. The quarterly lease on my shared office space is due Friday, and I'm just a little short. It's embarrassing, honestly, especially now when things with us are so perfect." There it was. The moment my father and Dom had warned me about. An alarm bell, faint but clear, went off in the back of my mind. I could hear my father's voice. "They can smell grief and money." I could see Dom's knowing eyes. Check for rot behind the fresh paint. My breath caught in my throat. But then I looked at him. I saw the shame on his face, the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, the tension in his shoulders. And my heart went to war with my head. My heart saw a good, proud man in a temporary bind, embarrassed to be so vulnerable in front of the woman he was trying to impress. My head saw a red flag the size of a billboard. You know that feeling, right? That tiny, quiet voice in the back of your head that whispers, "Wait a second. but everything else is screaming that you're just being paranoid. Let me know in the comments with a simple gut or heart, which one do you trust more when they're telling you two different things? In that moment, my heart won, decisively. To deny him would be to admit my father was right. It would be an act of distrust, and I loved him. Or, I desperately wanted to love him. How much? I asked, my voice steady. $2,500, he mumbled, still looking out the window. But Sarah, please don't even think about it. I'll figure it out. Don't be ridiculous, I said, walking over and taking his hand. We're a team. I'll transfer it to you right now. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen. He tried to protest, but his objections were weak, theatrical. It was a dance, and we both knew the steps. I hit confirm. The money left my account in seconds. And as I put my phone down, I felt the weight of those $2,500 settle not in my bank account, but squarely on my soul. It was the first real secret I had ever kept from my father. It would not be the last. The week that followed the transfer was agonizing. The secret felt like a physical weight in my chest, and I found myself avoiding my father and making excuses to cancel on Dom. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat. I was living in a state of suspended anxiety, waiting for either vindication or ruin. Then, on Friday morning, exactly as he'd promised, a notification lit up my screen, a direct deposit from Adrian for $2,500. The attached note was simple. See, we're a team. Thank you for trusting me when no one else would. The relief that washed over me was so total, so absolute, that it made me dizzy. It was more than just getting the money back. It was validation. I felt a smug, triumphant surge of righteousness. My father was wrong. Dom was wrong. Their cynical, jaded view of the world had been disproven. I had followed my heart, and my heart had been right. I had the urge to screenshot the notification and send it to them both, a digital "I told you so," but I couldn't. Admitting I'd been right would mean admitting I'd gone against their advice in the first place. So, the victory remained my own, a secret triumph that bonded me even closer to Adrian. It solidified the narrative in my head. It was us against a world that didn't understand. That single act of repayment was the most brilliant move he ever made. It wasn't just a returned loan, it was the key that unlocked the rest of my inheritance. He had silenced my inner alarms completely. My guard was not just lowered, it was dismantled. The next few weeks were the best of my life. He was attentive, loving, and utterly devoted. We were no longer just dating. We were planning. We spent an entire weekend with architectural paper spread across my dining room table, sketching out renovation ideas for the family home. He had an incredible eye for detail, suggesting ways to preserve the original heartwood pine floors and restore the intricate plaster medallions. He was investing his time, his creativity, his very essence into my dream. He was proving, day by day, that he was the partner I had been waiting for my entire life. Then, the next crisis hit. It came not as a quiet confession over wine, but as a frantic, panicked phone call late one night. I could hear the terror in his voice. "Sarah, something terrible has happened." He told me his custom-built server, the digital fortress where he stored all his proprietary client data and analytical models, had crashed. A catastrophic hardware failure. He threw around technical jargon, RAID array corruption, solid-state drive failure, data recovery specialist that was clearly designed to sound complex and overwhelming. The bottom line was simple. His entire business, his entire professional life, was on the verge of being wiped out. He sounded utterly broken. The manipulation this time was far more potent. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was devastated. He framed the disaster as a direct threat to our shared future. Everything we talked about, the house, traveling. "How can I even think about that now?" he said, his voice cracking. "How can I promise you a future when my own is turning to dust?" I was so close, Sarah. So close to being the man you deserve. He wasn't asking for a handout. He was mourning the future he was about to lose for both of us. He was making me the sole witness to his professional demise, and in doing so, he was subtly positioning me as his only possible savior. He needed $7,000. Immediately. For a top-tier data recovery firm and a new, more robust server system. He swore on his life it was a freak accident, a lightning strike of bad luck, and the absolute last time he would ever be in such a position. My resistance was practically non-existent. My brain, which had been so thoroughly reassured by the first repayment, now saw this not as a risk, but as a necessary emergency procedure. It was a surgery to save the life we were building together. It was an investment in us. I sent the $7,000. It was a huge amount, a significant piece of my grandmother's legacy. But in my mind, it wasn't a loss. It was a down payment. I wasn't just saving his business. I was buying our future. I just didn't realize the price was infinitely higher than I could ever imagine. After the $7,000 transfer, Adrian's gratitude was an overwhelming, all-consuming force. It was a tidal wave of affection and promises. He sent flowers to my office. He booked a surprise weekend trip to a boutique hotel in Charleston. He was repaying me, not with money, but with the very future I had just paid for. He was constantly talking about after. After this quarter, we'll be in the clear, he'd say. After I land this next client, we can finally make a formal offer on the house. He was selling me a life that was perpetually just around the corner, and I was buying every single word. My investment, I thought, was already paying dividends. He began dropping hints about a big project, a once-in-a-decade opportunity he was working on. He spoke about it in hushed, excited tones, making it sound like a state secret. He was building the narrative, creating an air of exclusivity that was intoxicating. Finally, one evening, he came to my apartment with a leather briefcase. He looked serious, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made my heart race. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I've been holding this close to my chest, but I can't move forward without you. We're a team. This involves both of us." He opened the briefcase on my coffee table and spread out a sheaf of impressive-looking documents. There were zoning maps, architectural renderings, and pages of financial projections that looked utterly professional. "This," he said, tapping a map of a large, undeveloped parcel of land just south of the historic district, "is our future." The story he spun was a masterpiece. He told me the land was owned by an elderly man who was about to sell to a major real estate developer. The developer planned to tear down the small, historic cottage on the property and build a block of soulless luxury condos. But, Adrian claimed, he had an inside track. He'd met the owner, bonded with him over a shared love for Savannah's history, and had convinced the old man to give him a small, exclusive window to buy the land first, if he could find a buyer who would respect its legacy. Adrian's plan was diabolically brilliant. We would use my inheritance to buy the land, and then, using a loophole in the zoning variance, immediately flip it to the same developer for more than double the price. He was speaking my language. "It's not just an investment, Sarah," he said, his eyes burning with sincerity. "It's an act of preservation. We save the cottage from demolition, and we make a massive profit in the process. It's a win-win." Then came the master stroke. He took a pen and paper and did the math. "You have $75,500 left from your grandmother," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We wire that to the escrow account now. In 90 days, the deal closes. We walk away with, conservatively, $150,000, maybe $160,000. We go to the bank, Sarah, and we pay cash for your family's home. No mortgage, no debt. Your promise is fulfilled. You hand your father the deed, free and clear." He painted a scene so vivid I could taste it. The look on my father's face, the tears of pride in his eyes, the feeling of walking through my ancestral home, knowing it was ours, forever. He wasn't asking me for money. He was offering me the conclusion to my own heroic epic. He was offering me salvation. Then came the pressure. "The owner gave me a 48-hour window," he said, his expression turning grave. "If we don't have the funds in escrow by Friday afternoon, he sells to the developers and the opportunity is gone. Forever." My mind was spinning. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. It was everything my grandmother had left me. But the logic, in the warped reality he had constructed for me, was flawless. The small loans had been the prelude. This was the grand finale. This was the move that would solve everything. I wasn't giving him money. I was funding our victory. The next morning, I walked into my bank. My hands were trembling, but my heart was filled with a dizzying mix of adrenaline and hope. I authorized the wire transfer. The bank teller read the amount back to me for confirmation. $75,500. I took a deep breath and said, "That's correct." The confirmation slip printed out. The last of my grandmother's legacy, the last of my family's hope, was gone. It had been sent out into the world to double, to triple, to come back and make me a hero. I walked out of that bank feeling like I was flying. I had no idea I had just leaped off a cliff. The first month after the transfer was pure adrenaline. Adrian and I were living in the future. We talked endlessly about the house, about the colors we'd paint the walls, the furniture we'd buy, the parties we'd throw. He made the dream so tangible that the 90-day waiting period felt like a mere formality, a short intermission before the main act of our lives began. He was a master at keeping the fantasy alive. He'd send me real estate listings for properties adjacent to our investment plot, talking about how our land's value was already increasing. It all felt so real, so incredibly professional. As the 90-day mark approached, the first snag appeared. It was a small thing, delivered with a reassuring smile. "Just a minor delay with the city's zoning commission, babe," he told me over dinner. "Totally normal for a deal this size. Bureaucracy, you know?" I nodded, accepting it without question. I was a partner in a high-stakes real estate deal. Of course, there would be delays. But then the 90-day deadline came and went, and the money didn't come. Adrian's excuses became more frequent and more convoluted. First, it was the zoning commission. Then, the elderly seller was supposedly having second thoughts, and Adrian's lawyers had to gently coax him back to the table. Then, the developer was allegedly trying to undercut the deal, forcing them into a tense renegotiation. Each excuse was delivered with the perfect amount of stressed-out sincerity. "He was fighting for us," he said. "He was in the trenches, protecting our investment." Simultaneously, he began to disappear. Texts that were once answered in seconds now took hours. Phone calls went to voicemail. His loving, attentive presence was replaced by a digital ghost who offered brief, vague updates before vanishing again. The man who had once made me feel like the center of the universe now made me feel like an inconvenience. The tension at home became unbearable. My father, who had been watching me with worried eyes for months, finally confronted me one evening. "Serafina, the bank sent another formal notice about the house," he said, his voice stripped of all its usual warmth. "The grace period is almost over. What happened to this perfect investment? Where is the money?" I tried to parrot Adrian's excuses, but hearing them out loud, they sounded flimsy, pathetic. I saw the look on my father's face shift from disappointment to a cold, rising anger. I wasn't just his daughter who had made a mistake. I was the one who had gambled away our family's soul. The final, shattering blow came on a Saturday. Adrian had told me he had to fly to Atlanta for the weekend for an emergency, face-to-face meeting with the investors to finally push the deal through. He sent me a photo of a generic hotel room to prove it. That afternoon, I had a consultation for a restoration project on the Isle of Hope, a beautiful, wealthy neighborhood on the other side of Savannah. As I was driving down a street lined with ancient oaks, I saw it. Parked right in front of a stunning waterfront home I'd never seen before was Adrian's car, a vintage silver Alfa Romeo convertible. It was unmistakable. My heart hammered against my ribs. It had to be a coincidence. I pulled over a block away, my hands shaking, and I waited. An hour passed. Then, the front door of the house opened. Adrian walked out laughing. He was with a woman, a chic blonde, and 2 small children. He kissed her, a casual, familiar kiss, the kind you give someone you've known for years. He then lifted the little girl into his arms and swung her around. It wasn't a business meeting. It was a family. He wasn't in Atlanta. He had never left. The hotel photo, the urgent meetings, the entire story, it was all a lie. It's a strange and terrible moment when all the little lies you've ignored suddenly snap together to form one monstrous truth. It's a physical feeling, a cold dread that starts in your stomach and spreads through your entire body. If you've ever had that sinking feeling, that moment you realize the story you were told was a complete lie, just hit that like button. It's a silent nod to everyone else here who knows exactly what that gut punch feels like. I sat there in my car, completely paralyzed, as I watched him play the part of a happy family man, the world tilted on its axis. The question was no longer, when will the money come back? It was, who is Adrian? And the horrifying unspoken answer was, not the man I thought he was. Not even close. The fantasy was dead. The nightmare was just beginning. I don't remember the drive home from the Isle of Hope. It's a black hole in my memory, a stretch of time erased by shock. I must have obeyed traffic laws, must have navigated the familiar turns back to my apartment, but I was a ghost in my own body. The only thing I remember is the image of him swinging that little girl in the air, the easy domestic bliss of it all, playing on a sickening loop in my mind. The charming man who discussed architecture with me, the devoted partner who was fighting for our legacy, he didn't exist. He was a character, a role he played, and I had been his most devoted audience. When I finally stumbled through my front door, the carefully constructed dam of my composure didn't just break, it exploded. I collapsed onto the floor in a heap, a storm of grief and rage, and a shame so profound it felt like it was physically crushing my bones. I wasn't just mourning the loss of the money, I was mourning the death of a future I had allowed myself to believe in. I was mourning the woman I thought I was, the smart, intuitive architect who could see the structural integrity of a building but couldn't see the rot in the man sleeping in her bed. I had given him my trust, my secrets, my hope, and my family's last chance. And he was a lie. The entire thing was a lie. After the hurricane of tears subsided, something else took its place, a cold, terrifying clarity. My father couldn't help me with this. His anger and disappointment would only amplify my own shame. There was only one person I could call, one person who wouldn't just see the heartbroken woman, but would see the crime. Swallowing the jagged shard of my pride, I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Dom's name. Making that call felt like the hardest thing I had ever done. It was an admission of catastrophic failure. "Dom?" My voice was a raw, broken whisper when he answered. "I need you. Something's happened. Something terrible." We met an hour later at a deserted bench overlooking the river, the evening air thick and heavy. Under the pale glow of a street lamp, I confessed everything. The whole sordid, humiliating story poured out of me. The $2,500 for the office space, the $7,000 for the server. The final, soul-crushing $75,000 for the phantom land deal. I told him about the house on the Isle of Hope, the woman, the children. I finished, my voice trailing off, and braced myself for the judgment, for the inevitable. "I told you so." But it never came. Dom just sat there, his hands clasped between his knees, his face a grim mask. When I finally ran out of words, he was silent for a long moment, just watching the dark water of the Savannah River flow by. Then he turned to me, his eyes clear and hard. "Okay, Sarah," he said, his voice devoid of any pity. It was the voice of a detective. "This isn't a breakup anymore. This is a crime scene." "What's the full name he gave you? The bank account details? His phone number? Give me everything you have." His professionalism was the first life raft I'd been thrown. He wasn't looking at me like a fool, he was looking at me like a witness. He told me to go home, lock my doors, and not, under any circumstances, contact Adrian. 2 agonizing days passed in complete silence. Then, he called, "Meet me at my office. We need to talk." I walked into the precinct feeling like a suspect. Dom led me to a small, sterile interrogation room. He had a thin manila folder on the table. He didn't waste any time. "There is no Adrian," he said, sliding a printout across the table. "His name is Julian Croft. He's married, has a wife, and 2 kids who live very comfortably on the Isle of Hope. He doesn't have an investment firm. He doesn't have a job at all, not a real one." He opened the folder. Inside were more printouts, police reports, a list of known aliases. He has formal complaints against him in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. The pattern is identical. He uses high-end dating apps to target women who have recently come into money, usually an inheritance or a divorce settlement. He builds a world for them, drains their accounts, and vanishes. The final sheet of paper he pushed toward me was a mugshot from an arrest 2 years ago in Florida for fraud. The charges had been dropped when the victim refused to testify, too humiliated to face him in court. The face in the picture was the same one that had whispered promises to me in the dark, but the eyes, they were cold, empty, devoid of the warmth and sincerity he had so expertly faked. It wasn't just a lie, it was a profession, and I wasn't his partner, I was his project. Leaving the police station felt like stepping out of one nightmare and into another. The grief over a lost love was gone, replaced by the cold, metallic reality of a crime. I was no longer a heartbroken woman, I was the star witness in a fraud investigation. I went home and spread the documents Dom had given me across my kitchen table. The mugshot, the list of aliases, the litany of other women, other lives he had dismantled. I stared at his face, the charming, handsome face I had memorized, and tried to see the predator underneath. For hours, I just sat there, trying to merge the two men in my mind. Adrian, who loved historic architecture, and Julian, the professional parasite. As per Dom's instructions, I had blocked him on the dating app and all social media, but I left his number unblocked on my phone. He's a narcissist with control issues, Dom had explained. When he feels you slipping away, he won't be able to stand it. He'll reach out, and when he does, I want you to be ready. 3 days of suffocating silence passed. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang with an unknown number. My entire body went cold. I knew it was him. Dom had coached me. Stay calm, be direct, and put the call on speaker. My hand was trembling so badly I could barely hit the screen. I took a ragged breath and answered. His voice, syrupy and smooth, poured through the speaker, thick with false concern. Sarah? Oh, thank God. I've been going out of my mind with worry. You vanished. You weren't answering my texts. I thought something terrible had happened to you. Are you okay, my love? Hearing him say my love felt like swallowing glass. The term of endearment that had once made my heart soar now made my skin crawl. I let him talk for another few seconds, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Then, I cut him off. My voice was quiet, but it was pure ice. Stop. Don't call me that. The silence on his end was different this time. It was charged, electric. What's wrong, Sarah? You sound different. I know your name is Julian, I said. The transformation was instantaneous. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever heard. The warmth in his voice didn't just fade, it evaporated. It was like a beautiful oil painting cracking and peeling away in an instant to reveal a canvas of pure, cold rot underneath. The charming, concerned Adrian was gone. In his place was a stranger, a voice flat and sharp as a razor's edge. What did you just say? He asked, the tone low and menacing. I know who you are, I repeated, my own voice shaking slightly. A short, ugly laugh crackled through the phone. So you've been busy, talking to that cop friend of yours? You think you're clever, don't you? Running to the police like a scared little girl. His voice started to rise, laced with a contempt that was breathtaking in its cruelty. You made a very, very big mistake, Serafina. He was spitting my name now, turning it into an insult. You think you can just get the police involved and ruin me? You have no idea who you're messing with. I know where you live. I know where you work. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air before delivering the final, devastating blow. And I know all about that precious, crumbling family home you're so desperate to save. You and your sad old father. You should be very, very careful. You cross me, and I will burn that whole legacy to the ground with you in it. It's a terrifying thing when the person you thought you knew vanishes, and in their place is a monster. All the kindness, all the love, it was just a costume. And what's underneath is ugly, and it is dangerous. Have you ever seen someone's true colors in a way that truly scared you? If you have, you don't need to share the story. Just type "mask off" in the comments below. We'll know what you mean. He hung up. I stood frozen in my silent apartment, his threat echoing in the empty space. The fear was like ice water in my veins, a primal terror that made me want to curl up and disappear. But underneath it, something else was burning. A white-hot, furious flame. He had threatened my father. He had threatened my grandmother's home. He had made this about my family. And in doing so, he had just signed his own death warrant. The victim was gone. In her place, a soldier was readying for battle. The icy tendrils of Julian's threat lingered in my apartment long after the call ended. The fear was real, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. He knew where my father lived. He knew the address of the house that held my entire family's history. For a moment, the primal urge to retreat, to hide, was overwhelming. I could just let the money go. I could disappear, change my number, and pray he would move on to his next victim. But then the image of my grandmother's face, her soft, smiling eyes, flashed in my mind. Then my father's, his face a mask of disappointment, not because I had lost the money, but because I had trusted a lie. Julian hadn't just stolen from me. He had tried to poison the very roots of who I was, and the fear was quickly burned away by a cold, righteous fury. He wanted a war. I would give him one. I met Dom the next day. I relayed the threat, word for word, my voice steady. I expected him to immediately put out a warrant for his arrest. Instead, he shook his head, a grim look on his face. "It's a verbal threat, Sarah," he said, she said. "He'll deny it, and right now it's your word against his. It adds to the case file, but it won't be the thing that puts him away. For that, we need to build an ironclad case on the fraud. We need to make it impossible for him to claim this was all a misunderstanding or a business deal gone wrong." He could see the frustration on my face. He leaned forward, his voice dropping, but his threat just gave us a new angle. He's predictable. He uses the same playbook every time, right down to the intimidation. I did some more digging, off the record. The woman from the Florida case 2 years ago, the one who dropped the charges? Her name is Isabella Rossi. She's a 65-year-old widow, a retired school teacher. Julian, or whatever name he used for her, cleaned out her entire retirement account. Everything. My heart ached for this woman I'd never met. "Why did she drop the charges?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Shame," Dom said, his voice hard, "and fear. I'd bet my pension he threatened her too. Probably threatened her children, her home. She was so humiliated and so scared that she just wanted him to disappear. It's his most powerful weapon, making his victims feel so foolish, so complicit in their own ruin, that they silence themselves." A new idea began to form in my mind, a path forward that wasn't just about my money or my family, it was bigger. "If she would testify now," I said, my voice gaining strength, "if she would add her story to mine, what would that do to the case?" Dom's eyes lit up. "It changes everything," he said. "It establishes a clear pattern of predatory behavior across state lines. He's no longer a charming boyfriend who fell on hard times. He's a serial predator. It becomes a RICO case. It's the nail in his coffin." I looked at him, my resolve hardening into steel. "Get me her number." Making that call was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. I was asking a stranger to voluntarily walk back into the darkest chapter of her life, to rip the scar tissue off a wound that had probably never truly healed. My finger hovered over the call button for a full 10 minutes. When I finally pressed it, my heart was pounding. An older woman's voice, cautious and frail, answered on the third ring. "Hello? Mrs. Rossi?" I began, my own voice trembling slightly. "My name is Serafina. You don't know me, but I believe we have someone in common." The silence on the other end was heavy, filled with a dread I understood completely. I told her I was working with the police in Savannah, and when I said Julian Croft's name, I heard a sharp intake of breath. Her voice, when it came back, was brittle. "I have nothing to say about that man. You're wasting your time. Please don't call me again." She was about to hang up, and in a rush of desperation I said, "Did he tell you he was building a legacy? Did he talk about his grandfather? Did he call you his partner, his team?" Another silence, but this one was different. It was the silence of recognition. "Don't," I said, my voice softening. "Don't hang up. I'm not calling to accuse you. I'm not the police. I'm the next one. He did the same thing to me. He took everything." I told her my story. I didn't frame it as a crime. I told it as a confession. I talked about my loneliness after my grandmother died, my desperation to be a hero for my family. And as I spoke, I heard a soft sound on the other end of the line. She was crying. "He told me. He told me I was the only one who truly understood him," she whispered through her tears. "He made me feel seen. For the first time since my husband passed. Her shame, her pain, her story, it was my own, just with a different name in a different city. In that moment, we weren't strangers. We were survivors." "It's not your fault, Isabella," I said softly. "It was never our fault. He's a professional. But right now, we have a chance to make sure there isn't a next one after me. Will you meet me? Just talk to me. That's all I ask." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of her shaky breath. Then, her voice came back, no longer frail, but with a flicker of the steel that had been buried for 2 years. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." My flight to Fort Myers to meet Isabella was booked for the following week. After hanging up the phone with her, a A strange sense of calm settled over me. Julian had isolated his victims, counting on their shame to keep them silent and separated. He never imagined we would find each other. He never imagined our shared pain could be forged into a weapon. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of real power. I was no longer just a victim. I was the co-founder of an alliance. But there was one more alliance I needed to rebuild, one more confession I had to make. I couldn't go to war for my family without my family standing beside me. It was time to face my father. I drove to the old family home that evening. I found him where I knew he'd be, in his study, a room that smelled of old books and cedar, surrounded by generations of family portraits. He was staring out the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking like a king surveying a crumbling kingdom. He looked older, more tired than I had ever seen him. "Dad," I said from the doorway. He turned, and his eyes were full of a weary pain. "I'm not here to make excuses," I said, walking into the room and standing before him. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to tell you exactly what happened and what I am going to do about it." I laid out the entire, unvarnished truth. I told him Julian's real name, about his wife and children. I told him about the police reports in 3 different states. I told him about Isabella, the retired school teacher in Florida he'd stolen from 2 years ago. And then I told him about the phone call. I repeated the threat, word for word. He said, "I will burn that whole legacy to the ground with you in it." As I spoke, I saw a storm gather in his eyes. When I finished, it broke. "I warned you!" he thundered, his voice booming in the quiet study. He slammed his whiskey glass down on the desk. "From the very beginning I told you what he was, and you were too stubborn, too blinded by this fantasy to listen. You didn't just throw away the money, Serafina. You invited a viper into our lives, and now he's threatening us? In our own home?" He was pacing now, a lion in a cage, his anger a terrifying mixture of fury at me and fear for our safety. "You have jeopardized everything our family has ever built because you refused to listen." In the past, I would have crumbled under the weight of his anger. I would have cried, apologized, and retreated. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I stood my ground, my hands clasped behind my back, and I let him unleash the storm. When he finally fell silent, his chest heaving, I met his gaze without flinching. "You're right," I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. "I was a fool. I was grieving, and I was naive, and I wanted to believe in something that wasn't real. You are right about all of it." I let that hang in the air for a moment, but that woman is gone. The woman standing in front of you now is going to take him down. I have found another one of his victims, a woman named Isabella. She has agreed to testify against him. I have a plan and I have the evidence, but I cannot do it alone. I took a step closer. I need my father. It's one of the hardest things in the world, isn't it? To stand in front of your parents and admit you made a catastrophic mistake. There's that dynamic. You want their help, but you don't want their judgment. You want to be their child, but you need to be seen as an adult. Every family has its roles. Let me know in the comments. Were you the fixer who was always expected to have it all together, or were you the dreamer who was always told to be more careful? I'm curious to see how many of us fall into those roles. He stopped pacing. He stared at me, really stared at me, and I could see him processing the change. The shame in my eyes had been replaced by fire. The desperation had been replaced by resolve. He was no longer looking at his foolish daughter. He was looking at a soldier. The anger drained from his face, replaced by something I hadn't seen in a very long time. A fierce, burning pride. He walked over and put his hands on my shoulders, his grip firm. "You are your grandmother's granddaughter. Through and through," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked past me, at the portraits on the wall. He didn't just swindle my daughter. He declared war on this family. And we do not lose wars. In that moment, in that study surrounded by the ghosts of our ancestors, I wasn't alone anymore. I had my father back. The fractured pieces of our family had just been forged into a weapon, and we were ready to go to war. Our family study, a room once filled with quiet grief, transformed into a war room. The scent of old books was now mixed with the sharp, metallic smell of adrenaline. Dom, in his off-duty civilian clothes, stood in front of the fireplace, pacing like a general, while my father and I sat at the large oak desk. We had a single objective: to get an unambiguous, in-person, recorded confession from Julian Croft. Dom made the stakes crystal clear. A phone threat is one thing, he explained, his voice low and serious. But to put him away for good, a jury needs to hear him, in his own voice, admit that this was a con from the start. We can't leave any room for him to claim it was a loan. We need him to brag. And I knew exactly how to make him brag. A predator like Julian isn't just motivated by money, he's motivated by ego. He needed to feel like he had won, like he had completely and utterly broken me. I was the one who had to be the bait. "I'll call him," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room. Both men looked at me. "I'll play the part. I'll be the terrified little girl he thinks I am. I'll tell him his threat worked. That I'm so scared for my family, I'll do anything he wants." My father started to protest. "Serafina, no. It's too dangerous. I won't have you in the same room as that monster." "He won't be alone with her," Dom interjected, putting a calming hand on my father's shoulder. "She'll be wired. I'll be there, with 2 other undercover officers. He'll never even know we're in the room." He turned to me. "What's the hook, Sarah? What's going to make him feel safe enough to boast?" "The ultimate prize," I said. A bitter taste in my mouth. "I'll tell him I took out an emergency loan against the equity of the house, that I'm giving him the last piece of the legacy he tried to steal. It's the kind of poetic, cruel victory he won't be able to resist." The phone call was the performance of a lifetime. I forced my voice to tremble, injecting a pathetic, pleading note into every word. "Julian, please, don't hurt my family," I whispered into the phone, the sound of a fake sob catching in my throat. "You were right. I was stupid to go to the police. I can get you more money. A lot more. I just need you to promise you'll leave us alone." The silence on his end was brief, followed by a voice that was pure, predatory silk. "Oh, Sarah," he purred, "I knew you'd come to your senses." We agreed to meet at the bar at the Perry Lane Hotel, a place that was public enough for me to feel safe, but dark and intimate enough for him to feel in control. He was convinced he was reeling in a fish that had already swallowed the hook. The day of the sting operation felt surreal. Dom met me in a parked car, a block from the hotel. He carefully fitted me with the wire, concealing the microphone in the back of a heavy, ornate silver earring. "The team is in place," he said, his eyes serious. 2 at the bar, 1 at a table by the door. "You are never out of our sight. Just let him talk. Let his ego do the work. Your only job is to be the victim he expects. We handle the rest." As I got out of the car, my father was waiting. He didn't say much. He just pulled me into a fierce hug, his hand shaking slightly. "Your grandmother would be so proud," he whispered. I walked through the hotel lobby, every nerve ending screaming. The polished marble floors felt like thin ice. The earring felt heavy against my skin, a tiny piece of technology pulsing with the weight of my family's future. I pushed open the heavy door to the bar, and the low murmur of conversations washed over me. And then I saw him. He was sitting in a dark leather booth in the corner, a glass of whiskey in his hand, bathed in shadow. He looked up as I approached, and he smiled. It was the same devastating, confident smile from our first date. He thought he was about to get everything he wanted. I was there to make sure he got exactly what he deserved. Walking towards that booth felt like walking into the heart of a storm. The ambient jazz of the bar seemed to warp and distort, the clinking glasses sounding like shattering ice. He watched me approach, a lazy, predatory confidence in his eyes. He didn't stand up. He just gestured to the seat opposite him with a flick of his wrist, a king granting an audience. I slid into the booth, the leather cool against my skin. My hands were trembling, so I hid them under the table, clenching them into tight fists. "You look scared," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "You should be. You almost made a very costly mistake." "I know," I said, forcing my voice to sound small and breathy. I couldn't look him in the eye, so I focused on the condensation on his glass. "I never should have doubted you, Julian. It was my father." He got in my head. He and Dom. "Ah, yes, the soldier and the cop," he said with a dismissive wave. "Predictable men. They see the world in black and white. They could never understand what we have, what we're building." He reached across the table, and my entire body went rigid as he placed his hand over mine. His touch felt like a brand. I didn't pull away. I let him hold my hand, my skin crawling, the earring on my right ear feeling as heavy as an anchor. "But you're here now," he continued, his voice dropping into that familiar, intimate purr. "That's all that matters. So, tell me, what have you brought for me, Sarah?" This was it. The performance had to be flawless. I went to the bank, I stammered, making sure to let my voice crack. I told them it was for an emergency roof repair on the house. I took out a loan against the equity. It's the last of it. $100,000. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of pure, unrestrained greed. He squeezed my hand. "You did well," he said, as if praising a child. "You see how easy it is when you just trust me? When you stop listening to those other voices?" I nodded, finally daring to look up at him, making sure my eyes were wide with a feigned, desperate hope. "But you have to promise me, Julian. This is it. After this, we're done with all the stress. We just take the money, and we start our life together. The house, everything." He laughed. It wasn't the warm, charming laugh from our first date. It was a low, guttural sound, full of arrogance and contempt. "Oh, my sweet, naive Serafina," he said, leaning back into the booth. "You still don't get it, do you?" My heart stopped. "Get what?" "There is no us," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "There is no house. There was never going to be a house. There was only you, and your sad little inheritance, and a story I wrote just for you." It was the confession I needed, but hearing the words spoken so plainly, so cruelly, still felt like a physical blow. The air left my lungs. "Why?" I whispered, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 broken promises. He leaned forward again, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He thought he was explaining his genius to an idiot. He was bragging, because I could. "Because women like you are so desperate to be saved, so desperate for a fairy tale, you'll ignore every red flag in the book. You wanted a hero, so I became one. That old woman in Florida, Isabella? She wanted a confidant, a man to fill the silence her dead husband left behind. So I became him. Every single one of you gets the man you deserve." His ego was a bottomless pit, and I just kept feeding it. So the land deal, the server, it was all? A script, he finished for me, a proud smile spreading across his face. "And you played your part perfectly. You were the best of them all, Sarah. So eager to believe. So willing to fight your own family for me." He shook his head in mock pity. It was almost too easy. He thought he was delivering the final, crushing blow, the ultimate assertion of his power. He had no idea he was writing the final line of my testimony. He had no idea that every cruel, boastful word was being captured, preserved, a digital monument to his own downfall. It's a strange thing, to sit across from your own monster and see not a mastermind, but a pathetic, insecure man whose only skill is to prey on the hope of others. Sometimes the biggest monsters aren't the ones who look scary, but the ones who look like everything you've ever wanted. If you understand what I mean by that, type "I understand" in the comments. It's for everyone who's ever had to look past a beautiful mask. I slowly pulled my hand from under his. I straightened up in my seat, the fear and the victimhood falling away from me like a snake shedding its skin. I met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw the real me. The confusion on his face was immediate. The smile faltered. "What's this?" he asked, his voice losing its confident edge. I didn't say a word. I just gave him a small, cold smile of my own. And then, from the shadows of the bar, 2 men stood up and started walking towards our table. Dom was one of them. Julian's eyes darted from me to them and back again, the dawning horror on his face, a more beautiful sight than any sunrise I had ever seen. He had walked into my trap, and the jaws were just about to snap shut. The moment Julian saw Dom's face, a flicker of genuine panic flashed in his eyes, but it was instantly replaced by his default setting, arrogant indignation. "Excuse me, officer," he began, his voice smooth as ever. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. This is a private conversation." Dom didn't say a word. He simply placed a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder. "Julian Croft," he said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that cut through the bar's ambient noise. "You're under arrest for grand larceny and fraud." The color drained from Julian's face. His entire reality seemed to crumble in that single instant. "This is absurd," he sputtered, trying to stand, but Dom's partner was already there, pulling his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. His charming facade shattered, and the venom underneath poured out. "You!" he snarled at me, his face a contorted mask of pure hatred. "You stupid little bitch! You'll pay for this!" His outburst was cut short as the officers escorted him out, a pathetic, raving fraudster being hauled away from his last failed performance. I just sat there in the booth, the recording still silently active on my phone, and for the first time in nearly a year, I took a full, deep breath. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal machinery. Meetings with a sharp, no-nonsense assistant district attorney, endless depositions, and the methodical organization of our evidence. Our case, she told me, was an absolute fortress. We had the meticulous bank records, the screenshots of his lies, and the crown jewel, the high-fidelity recording of his boastful, arrogant confession. But the key, she stressed, the thing that would turn this from a simple fraud case into a story a jury could never forget, was Isabella. When the trial began, the courtroom felt like a sterile, airless stage. Julian was there, in an ill-fitting suit, looking smaller and somehow grayer under the harsh fluorescent lights. He tried to smile at me, a pathetic attempt at his old charm, but I met his gaze with nothing but ice. My father sat in the front row, a silent granite pillar of support. When I took the stand, his lawyer tried to paint me as a naive, scorned lover who had concocted a story for revenge after a bad breakup. I didn't get angry. I didn't get emotional. I simply and calmly walked the jury through the architectural blueprint of his deception, from the first small loan to the final, devastating transfer. And when the prosecutor played the recording from the hotel bar, the entire courtroom was silent, listening to Julian's own voice convict himself. But the most powerful moment of the trial came when Isabella Rossi walked to the stand. She was a small, grandmotherly woman, but she moved with a quiet dignity that filled the entire room. She told her story, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with every word. She spoke of how Julian, or Marcus, as he had called himself then, had preyed on her loneliness after her husband's death, stealing the $200,000 she had saved for her grandchildren's college education. She didn't cry. She just spoke her truth, her eyes fixed on the jury. "He didn't just steal my money," she said, her voice ringing with a powerful clarity. "He stole my trust in the goodness of people. I am here today so that he can never do that to anyone else again." It was a devastating blow. The jury was out for less than 3 hours. When they filed back in, I held my breath. The foreman stood and looked not at Julian, but at me and Isabella. On the charge of grand larceny, we the jury find the defendant, Julian Croft, guilty, on all counts. A shuddering exhale escaped my lips, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. The judge was merciless. He spoke of Julian's predatory nature, his complete lack of remorse, and the calculated cruelty of his crimes. He was sentenced to 7 to 10 years in a state penitentiary. The judge's final order was for the complete seizure of his known assets, the silver convertible, the contents of his bank accounts, and a lien against his share of the waterfront home on the Isle of Hope to be liquidated for restitution. It wouldn't be all of it, not even close, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement. It was justice. As they led him away in chains, his eyes found mine one last time. They were filled with a cold, impotent hatred, but this time I felt nothing. The space inside me where my love and fear for him had lived was now just a quiet, empty room. The gavel had fallen, and it felt like the closing of a tomb. The monster was caged. The ghosts were quiet. Justice, it turned out, wasn't a fiery explosion of revenge. It was a quiet, steady light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel. Walking out of that courthouse was like waking up from a long, suffocating fever. The world seemed brighter. The air in my lungs felt cleaner. The constant grinding hum of anxiety that had been my companion for nearly a year was suddenly gone. In its place was a profound, bone-deep quiet. For weeks, I moved through my life in that quiet, reacquainting myself with the woman I had been before Julian. I poured myself back into my work, finding a new comfort in the solid, honest history of brick and mortar. I restored cornices, repaired sash windows, and found a simple, grounding peace in making broken things whole again. Months passed. The seasons began to turn. Then, one afternoon, a thick manila envelope arrived from the district attorney's office. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a long, formal letter detailing the liquidation of Julian's seized assets, and clipped to the back was a cashier's check made out to me for $41,257. I stared at the number. It was a substantial amount, a tangible piece of my victory, but it was also a stark reminder of the $44,000 that was still gone, lost forever in the black hole of his deception. It was justice, but it was an incomplete justice. It wasn't enough to save the house. I took the check to my father that evening. I laid it on the desk in his study, the same room where our family had declared war. I expected a practical, somber discussion about selling the property, about accepting our losses and moving on. Instead, he looked at the check, then he looked at me, and his eyes were full of a light I hadn't seen since before my grandmother passed. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a document of his own, sliding it across the desk to me. It was a deed of sale. "What's this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's a small parcel of undeveloped land our family has owned out by the coast for nearly a century," he said quietly. "I sold it last month." He pointed to the check in my hand. "Your victory got us halfway there. This will get us the rest of the way home." I stared at him, speechless. Tears welled in my eyes. "Dad, you didn't have to do that." He reached out and placed his hand over mine. "I was so obsessed with preserving the past," he said, his voice thick with emotion, so terrified of losing that house, that I almost lost sight of what truly matters. Our legacy isn't a building, Serafina. It's the people who live in it. It's the strength we show when we face the world together. Your grandmother didn't leave you a burden. She left you a test of character, and you passed it with more courage than I could ever have imagined. The next day, my father and I walked into the bank together. It was the same bank where I had, alone and terrified, wired away my family's future. This time, I walked in with my head held high, my father's steady presence beside me. We stood before the bank manager and presented the 2 checks. The transaction was quiet, formal, and deeply profound. We paid off the remaining debt in full. The manager stamped the final document, shook our hands, and handed us the deed to the house, free and clear of any lien. We drove back to the house, the deed resting on the seat between us. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like a salvaged soul. We stood on the grand, wraparound porch, the same porch I had promised my grandmother I would save. The evening sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and the scent of magnolias hung in the air. Julian had used the word legacy as a tool of manipulation, a key to unlock my deepest vulnerabilities. But standing there, beside my father, I finally understood what the word really meant. Legacy wasn't in the money he stole, or even in the timber and nails of the house itself. It was in the unbreakable bond of a family that had weathered the storm. It was in the quiet pride in my father's eyes. It was in the strength I had discovered within myself, a strength forged in the fires of betrayal. He put his arm around my shoulder. "She would be so proud of you," he said softly. I leaned my head against him, looking out at the home that was finally, truly ours. The revenge was complete, not because a conman was sitting in a jail cell, but because we were here, together, whole again, stronger than ever before. It took me a long time to understand that strength isn't a shield that prevents you from ever getting hurt. Strength is the courage to stand in the ruins of what you thought was your life, and decide to build again. I believed, I loved, I hoped, and I was deceived. For a while, I was ashamed of that. I saw my hope as a weakness, my trust as a flaw. But it's not a crime to want to believe in the goodness of another person. The crime is in the calculated exploitation of that beautiful, human instinct. What I learned wasn't to stop trusting, but to start listening. To listen to that quiet, persistent voice in the back of my head, the one that sounds a lot like a good friend telling you to check for rot behind the paint. Our gut feeling is the oldest and most honest architect we have. It designs our boundaries to keep us safe, and ignoring its blueprint is a mistake you only make once. I was a victim, but I refused to stay one. I am a survivor. My story is finished, but I know there are so many others out there, just beginning or in the middle of their own battles. The world may not always see your fight, but here, we do. If these stories of survival and reclamation speak to your truth, subscribe and join a community that understands. You are not alone. I'm moving forward now, with clearer eyes and a stronger heart. I haven't given up on love, but I've given up on fairy tales. The next time I let someone into my life, it will be a partnership built not on grand promises, but on small, consistent truths. Because I finally understand that true love, real partnership, takes nothing from you that you aren't willing to give freely. It doesn't drain your legacy. It helps you build a new one.